Well, welcome this evening, and thanks for joining. Now, I want to say a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, I remember preaching a sermon where I focused on forgiveness, and I think it was probably in a place where Jesus said, was talking about forgiveness or forgiving 70 times 70 or whatever. And that's where I came up with the idea of forgiveness as the Christian F word, because we talk about it, yet we don't really talk about it. But anyway, so that's sort of where I came up with the title. It's meant to be sort of a humorous thing. So forgiveness, the Christian F word, or maybe God forgives you, but I'm still working on it. Carrie sent me this quote from Richard Rohr. Forgiveness is to let go of our hope for a different or better past. That's a great quote because it's one aspect of forgiveness, and that's something that I want to bring out in this evening's presentation. So I want to do the presentation first and just kind of share with you some of what I've looked into and some of my thoughts and so on, and then end with a question. And then what we can do is we can end the recording, and then we can just go into a time of discussion. So forgiveness is I think lots of different things, and I think it's very contextual. But forgiveness also has a lot of historical, cultural, religious, linguistic baggage, and that's some of what I want to look into. But I'll start with things we often say related to forgiveness. So, and you can see different approaches to forgiveness here. I'll forgive, but I won't forget. And then, of course, you have to ask, well, is that really forgiving if you don't forget? Or is forgiving contingent on forgetting? I don't know. They have to apologize before I forgive them. That raises the whole question of, can I forgive someone who hasn't asked to be forgiven? Or am I obligated to forgive someone regardless, and so on and so forth? This is something I can never forgive. Is that possible? Is it possible never to? Well, I think it's possible never to forgive, but is there really a thing that can never be forgiven? I don't know. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Again, it's all very contextual. If you don't forgive, it'll just eat you up from the inside. It's another aspect. What are we doing when we forgive? Are we kind of letting go of things? And if I'm letting go of it so that it doesn't eat me up on the inside, is it really forgiveness, or is it just me trying to preserve myself? You're only hurting yourself if you don't forgive. That's kind of the same idea. I can forgive them, but there need to be consequences for their actions. That's a kind of a classic sort of medieval church approach, right? You can go to the priest and you can get forgiveness, but the consequences were always penances, right? You had to do certain penances, certain prayers, certain extra things. And if it was a really big thing, it might be a pilgrimage to somewhere, or, eventually it was the indulgences, right? Paying for forgiveness and so on and so forth. And the whole rationale behind the indulgence was that this was a consequence. So, you can do your confession and have kind of contingent, your forgiveness pronounced to you contingent upon your payment of this sum, and so on and so forth. Forgiveness, what does that even mean? What does it really mean for me to forgive, or for me to be forgiven? Groups of people, can groups of people forgive each other, or is it a purely individual undertaking? How does any of that work? So I think there's a lot of confusion around forgiveness. And one of the reasons in our Christian context, our Western civilization Christian context, is that the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament talk about forgiveness in two different ways. We're getting two different messages. Um, Another thing is every culture and even every family system has different assumptions around forgiveness and its value, usefulness, importance, or purpose. So let's take, for example, the family of Donald Trump. I don't think forgiveness is a big thing, or maybe even a thing, in that family system. It's not important. It just gets in the way. Um, so other things take their place in mediating the relationships between people. Because forgiveness, of course, is a way that we mediate our relationships with each other. And so instead, you might have revenge. Where you don't have forgiveness, often revenge is getting back at people, or the cold shoulder. I'll just sort of push them out of my life, and then they'll have no benefit from whatever. So that's just an example of, and then in other families, forgiveness might be so important, like you have to forgive, and so you might grow up in a family where you're told, you must forgive this person, you have to do that, that's your obligation. And so what becomes of that kind of forgiveness, and so on. Social inequality between the offender and the offended changes that dynamics around forgiveness. One size does not fit all. And just related to that, in the history of Christianity, it has often been the privileged, clergy, men, telling others they should forgive. And so you get into this whole situation of, this, the servant in the household, upstairs, downstairs, right, has been, harmed by the Lord or whatever, and so religiously they may be told, the priest may say, well, you just have to forgive him. Or you see this often in abusive relationships, where the partner, usually the woman, is told, well, you just have to forgive. And in conservative Christian circles, evangelical circles, and Roman Catholic circles, I know that that's often the approach taken, the line. But there's this social inequality, and so how can that even work when you have this uneven power dynamic? For the weaker, not the weaker, the more vulnerable, to forgive the one who's being oppressive. And what would it mean for that person to forgive the other person? That becomes this kind of condescending act. I forgive you, because I am the nice one. So forgiveness becomes kind of an icky emotional manipulation, and so on. Socially expected forgiveness in communal Christian expressions such as Mennonites, Hutterites, in other words, these kind of close and often closed, very traditional Christian communities, the semi-communal or communal Christian communities, they have an expectation of forgiveness. But as you may be aware from the new novel by, not new novel, but this novel by what's the first name? Margaret Taves? No,
Miriam Toes.
Miriam Taves, um, about this Mennonite community in Paraguay, I believe, maybe it was Brazil, where this abuse was going on. That sort of expectation of forgiveness can easily get abused. So there are lots of complex issues around forgiveness. So I want to do a little bit of a biblical review. As I said, the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament uh, talk about forgiveness in different ways. So in the Hebrew scriptures, God is the one who forgives. That's not what people are called to do. People seek justice and restitution. And the reason for that is, and so you have to kind of put yourself into the mind frame, the conceptual mind frame of the ancient world, the ancient Middle East. Ancient world monarchs were the givers and guarantors of their systems of law. To break the law was to transgress against the monarch. So beyond whatever restitution the injured party might be receiving from the law, there had to be a price, a punishment to satisfy the anger of the monarch, sometimes as a fine, which didn't go to the harmed victim, but went to the monarch, which still happens, right? We pay fines to the state. Sometimes imprisonment, sometimes an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So in the Hebrew scriptures, in the system of, the Torah, the Genesis through Deuteronomy, what it usually looks like is that the way when you transgress, you sin. In other words, you miss the mark, right? Because that's what the Hebrew term for sinning, for sin is. It's to miss the mark, to miss the target. You miss the target of behavior, then you are expected to bring an offering, a grain offering, usually to the priest, as to obtain forgiveness from God. But then you are still expected to, justice is still expected, and that's where the elders in the gate come in. So you may have noticed that term in the Hebrew scriptures, the elders in the gate. So in Israelite society, the towns were all walled, or any town of any size had a wall around it, and there was the main gate. Sometimes there were secondary gates, but there was the main gate, and that was the place where the elders of the city would sit and hang out and chew the cud, but also where they would be approached then by members of the village or the town to mediate disputes, and or to witness contracts. And you see, the beautiful example of this in Ruth, when Boaz needs to redeem this piece of property, and so he goes to the elders and he explains the situation, and then they endorse it, and then but they say you have to go and do this thing, but before we can do this, you have to go and do this one thing to this one fellow who's actually related more closely, and he does that, and he says that's fine, and da 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 da. So anyway, so it's people aren't expected in the Hebrew scriptures to forgive each other. There's no demand of forgiveness, but there is a demand of restitution and justice and so on and so forth. And again, that's sort of handled by the elders in the gate. So that's the basic system that you see laid out in the Torah, and then we hear stories that involve that in Judges and Ruth, and in the kingdom period. And then, of course, once there's a king, it changes the dynamic a little bit. Before the judge, like Deborah and Gideon and so on and so forth, they were the sort of court of final appeal in these disputes. And once there's a king, then the king becomes the court of final appeal in this situation. But the king of Israel is not the one who gave the laws. God gave the laws. And so that's the one that the sacrifice has to go to, and so on and so forth. So Israel is a bit different in that sense. It becomes this kind of hybrid monarchy, theocracy, sort of 50-50 thing. Okay, I'm looking for my cursor. There it is. So enter the Greeks. As you've probably heard me say before, what we call the Hebrew scriptures came together out of older and newer material around the year 500 BCE, so about 500 years before the time Jesus was born. I mean, in a range in there, but that's just use that as a simple number to hang your hat on. And so by the time, and so that's at the end of the exile, the Babylonian exile, and then the Persian period when Israel is ruled by the Persians. And then comes Alexander the Great, and he conquers the Persian Empire, and his successors rule that space for a number of centuries. And they bring this culture with them. This becomes the modern culture. This becomes the trendy thing, the thing that the people in high positions go for, and it's fashionable to learn Greek and to build buildings the way the Greeks do, and to dress the way the Greeks do, and to put things in your cities like the Greeks have, like theaters and schools of philosophy or whatever, different things like that. So what happens is during that time, during the Persian period, large numbers of Jews, Judahites, ended up in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, and Egypt came to be ruled by Alexander's general Ptolemy, and his successors became the king or pharaohs of Egypt during that time. And Alexandria was, of course, founded by Alexander during his life, and it was a very Greek city, and it was the capital of Egypt. And the rabbis there came to a situation where most of the people they were teaching and so on didn't speak Hebrew anymore, and so they needed to put the Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language to, make it more available to their 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 co-religionists. And so they undertook a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This is the first translation we know of the Hebrew scriptures into another language. And it must have been quite a challenge, because Hebrew and Greek are very different languages with very different cultural assumptions and so on and so forth. And so the body of work they came up with is called, and it didn't happen all at once, it happened over about 150 years. They started with the Torah, made a fairly literal translation of the Torah into Greek, and then other books seem to have been added over the decades. And some of the works were a little more paraphrasy in nature, but anyway, so you get what becomes this Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, and it is called the Septuagint, because and the symbol for it is the Roman numeral 70, because the tradition is that the Ptolemy of the time, the Ptolemies always had Ptolemy the first, the second, third, fourth, fifth, they always had the same name, and the women were always Cleopatra, and sometimes Cleopatras ruled in their own right. And as we know, the last of these Greek rulers of Egypt was Cleopatra the seventh, was it? I don't remember. Anyway, that one, the famous one. But she wasn't the first, and women in her position always had the name Cleopatra. Anyway, was it where was I here? So anyway, the tradition is that the Ptolemy of the day said, we should put this in Greek so that I can read it too. And so he got 70 different rabbis together and sent them off into 70 different rooms to translate the whole thing all at once. And when they all came out of their rooms, they all had exactly the same translation. Wow, amazing. How can this be? Anyway, so that's the tradition. And of course, that's the kind of story you tell to try to emphasize the accurateness of the translation, and also the sort of divine inspiration of the translation. But as we know, that didn't happen that way. It was a kind of a process over a number of generations. Anyway, so it's useful to look at what those rabbis in Alexandria did at the time, because we get a sense of how they understood those Hebrew words. Because the thing about Hebrew is, the only major example of ancient Hebrew we have are the Hebrew scriptures. And we can see within the Hebrew scriptures layers of kind of the change of the language and how it evolved over the centuries. But it is a limited kind of collection of writings. And all of the Hebrew scriptures, the whole thing, only has a vocabulary of 5,000 words. Greek, by contrast, we have a continuous written record of Greek from, well, if you go back to linear B, not linear A. If you go back to linear B, which is at the end of the Mycenaean period, then we have 3,500 years, 3,500 continuous years of written Greek. And so we have a very good record of the origin of the words, the evolution of the words, the different uses of the words. And of course, it's still a living language, right? I mean, Hebrew, by contrast, died out and then was revived in the 19th century by the Russian Zionists. And so by knowing what the rabbis chose, the Alexandrian rabbis chose to translate these Hebrew words, one, it helps us understand the Hebrew a little bit better, but also it gives us a sense of where they saw the sort of conceptual links between the two texts. So I always like to go back to the Septuagint and see what it's got for us. So here's what we see. The Greek words aphianai, to forgive, that's the verb, and aphesis, forgiveness, that's the noun, are used to translate a whole array of Hebrew words that cover the range of meanings: release, surrender, leave in peace, remission, etc. Right? So there isn't a word for forgiveness in the Hebrew of the Hebrew scriptures. What you have is these different words that the rabbis then use this one Greek word for. Well, I was going to say, by contrast, 5,000 vocabulary, 5,000 words of 5,000 individual words, different words in the Hebrew scriptures versus in the New Testament, which is, I think a quarter the size of, or maybe less, of the Hebrew scriptures, 30,000 words, 30,000 different words. So Greek is just a much richer language in terms of vocabulary. But interestingly, what the rabbis did there was they took this kind of one word. There's another secondary word that's often used. I think it's paraphene, different prefix. Instead of the a, it's the para, but it means a similar kind of thing. Basically, they chose this one set of words to mean all these different words. Now, the Greeks used that verb aphianai to mean to send off, to hurl, to release, to let go, to let be. So you can see why they chose that word. And the noun, aphesis, usually had the legal sense of being released from a legal obligation. For example, being released from an office, being released from a marriage, being released from a debt, being released from a sentence or punishment. But it was never used in a religious sense. It was always simply in a legal sense, or a sort of political sense, you could say, in terms of offices in the polis, in the city-state. So you can see that the rabbis there have to make this kind of thing, but you can also see how this kind of bridge, they have to bridge this conceptual world. But you can see that the words they chose have sort of similar meanings. Now, biblical review for Jesus blends the two together. Like the Hebrew scriptures, Jesus talks about forgiveness from God rather than calling for ritual sacrifice for this. So Jesus also talks about the forgiveness that comes from God, right? And that's actually a very big theme of Jesus, but that's based on the Hebrew scriptures, God forgiving or not forgiving. So God's forgiveness. But rather than calling for ritual sacrifice as part of this process, instead, Jesus makes a link between our forgiving of others and God forgiving us. So, for example, at the end, I don't know if I need to read this or not, but you may remember this, that at the end of when in Matthew, this is just in Matthew, when Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer, he says, "For if you forgive, you will be forgiven, but if you do not forgive, you will not be forgiven," right? And so there's that kind of idea, that sort of link there. Or in Luke, and of course each of the Gospels has a slightly different take on things, it links it to the simple fact of knowing that we are in need of forgiveness. And so there's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and of course the Pharisee goes in to the temple and says, "Thank you, God, for not making me like this horrible tax collector here. I'm better than he is." And then the tax collector walks in and says, "I am not worthy. I'm not worthy of your forgiveness, da 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 da." And Jesus says, "I tell you that the latter of the two, the tax collector, went home forgiven," right? Implying that the first did not. And it was simply because he understood his need for forgiveness. So that's the kind of the God part of it. But then Jesus connects the letting go and releasing concepts of the Greeks, and he makes so so we know that Jesus talks about, you need to forgive. Where was I here? I'm getting lost in my own stuff here. Yeah, okay, I already talked about that. He makes the link about forgiving others and God's forgiveness, right? So he's linking these two things. So to connect the letting go and the releasing concepts of the Greeks, Jesus makes frequent use of economic metaphors to talk about forgiveness. And this is actually where I usually go to when I talk about forgiveness in a kind of a a Lutheran context, or let's say a Protestant Christian context. And when we have discussions about what do I do with forgiveness, um, Jesus often uses these economic metaphors. So in Matthew 18:21, the unforgiving servant, or in Luke, the two debtors. In the unforgiving servant, the Lord, the master, whatever, forgives the servant a huge debt because he asks to have it forgiven. Then the servant turns around and demands payment from these other servants, and even sends one to prison or something, and then the master finds out about it, and there's this horrible punishment. But I think that the idea that Jesus is saying is like, you've been forgiven this huge debt. Don't hold these little petty debts against other people. Or in the two debtors, Jesus poses the hypothetical question, if this one fellow had, $1,000 forgiven, and this other fellow had $100 forgiven, which one will love his master more? And the answer is, well, the one who had the more money, get a bigger debt canceled. Well, there you go. And so I think the usefulness of that model is when you're in a situation and you're wondering if you should work on forgiving someone, then I often pose the question, well, what do they owe you? What is it that they owe you? Because you have to know what you expect of them before you can know what it means to forgive them, right? Because you're going to be forgiving something, you're going to be canceling a debt. What's the debt? And that's just a good place to kind of get people thinking about the issue that they're dealing with. So biblical review number 5, this is the last of these, the epistles and beyond. In the New Testament church, forgiveness became one of the hallmarks of the life of faith, and calling people to forgive one another as God in Christ has forgiven you. So that becomes kind of the basic premise. God has forgiven you, therefore you should forgive others. And that particular verse comes at the end of a section that lays out kind of all these characteristics of the faithful life. What does it mean to be faithful, humble, gentle, loving, so on and so forth, and then forgive one another in God as Christ has forgiven you. And of course, that's within the context of this community, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. This universal call to forgive becomes the default understanding in what I call classic Christian ethics. In other words, the Christian ethics in the ancient, medieval, and early modern, Reformation and early modern periods. This is kind of the basic concept of Christian forgiveness. So is that a guilt trip because I've been forgiven, I have to forgive? I don't know. Good question. So I think it's important to contextualize forgiveness. Traditional Christian language around forgiveness is often so categorical and abstract that it fails to take into account specific familial, social, economic, and political realities. It was originally conceived within the context of a close-knit group of like-minded people who had all had similar religious experiences. So it's one thing to be, working on that project of universal forgiveness within that group, and then perhaps trying to extend that out beyond the boundaries of that group as a kind of outreach. But it's a very different thing once you get to the situation where everything is all mixed up and you have so many different people coming from so many different places in the whole forgiveness thing. So applying this model of forgiveness beyond such a tight situation will always be problematic. Here's some, questions to ask about forgiveness. What is the point of forgiveness? And when we get into the discussion, we can get into these, and I can put them up again so we can see them. But what is the point of forgiveness? Why bother forgiving? What difference does that make? When it says that God has forgiven me, what is it that God has forgiven? Do I even want to be forgiven if that puts an obligation on me? Maybe I don't want to be forgiven. Then I don't have to do anything. Here are some practical thoughts. Thinking about forgiveness as an aspect of healthy relationship, cutting each other some slack, right? Again, forgiveness has to do with relationships and ultimately with restoring broken or fractured relationships. So forgiveness, thinking about forgiveness as a way of being generous with each other, right? Of cutting each other some slack, allowing room, okay, we'll let this one go. I forgive you. Let's move on. Let's try again. Thinking about forgiveness as one component in a longer process of reconciliation. Getting to the point of moving beyond old wrongs in a parallel to the AA 12 steps, where the recovering alcoholic has to confront themselves on the things they did, and then approach other people, the people they've wronged, and sort of confess to them, and perhaps maybe even get some forgiveness, but not expect it, right? So that's kind of that's in a lot of ways a very healthy model. Thinking about forgiveness as a tool for creating inner peace about old wounds, like the Greek concept and the Hebrew concept, letting go, moving on, giving up on trying to change the past. And so I put it to you, what are your thoughts to share?
Curtis,
Right.
before we launch into everything, I was just wondering if you'd just do a quick, just riff a little bit on prodigal son, the parable of the prodigal son, and the role forgiveness plays in that parable.
Riff. Well, the prodigal son, that's a particular relationship. In this case, it's a father and two sons, and one of the sons does something that socially it's not kosher, it's not cool, and yet the father, indulges him and gives him his part of the inheritance before the father's even died, and the son goes off and blows it and falls on hard times, and we have to kind of skip a little bit and say, meanwhile, the older brother is there working on the estate, doing all this stuff, and apparently the father is being very, very cheap with him and not giving him money to have parties and stuff with his friends, or at least that's what he says later on. So the younger son comes back, and he's got this plan, and the plan is to say, Father, I'm not worthy to be your son. Let me come back as one of your servants. But before he can even finish that sentence, the father reinstates him. So basically has forgiven everything, has forgiven the debt of the wasted money, has forgiven the debt of the insult, and this, bizarre demand to give me my inheritance even while you're still alive, and has, brought him back in, and then he throws a party for him, and let's kill the fatted lamb, and let's have a party. And so when the older brother comes in from the fields and says, what's happening? What's the party about? And the servant tells him, he's furious. He's furious at his father, and he's furious at his brother for this thing. And of course, we hear that famous moment of distancing, where the older son says to the father, this son of yours who wasted everything on, profligate living on, all kinds of stuff. He's assuming he doesn't know because he's just come back. And and he comes back and you treat him like a king. And meanwhile, here I am working hard for you, and you don't even give me a calf and some wine to have a party with my friends. And then, of course, the father at the end says, "Come on, son, loosen up, lighten up," because of course it's also about the older son, the older brother forgiving his younger brother, because this your brother was lost, but now he is found, right? He's been restored, and you should rejoice in that. So it's such a powerful story because it has such complex dynamics, and the father is making choices that in that culture wouldn't necessarily be the assumed choice. Jesus is kind of cutting against the grain, and kind of challenging people to think differently about their social assumptions, but also to bring in sort of an ethic of forgiveness into their relationships. Of course, this is also meant to be an image of God to us, because Jesus's whole thing is, that God is all about forgiving and restoring. And because God is forgiving and trying to restore, then we have an obligation to be part of that process of forgiving and restoring, to recreate wholeness in the universe, right? Or in the society at least. But that forgiveness has to be part of that thing, letting go of the thing you think somebody else owes you. So letting go of my sense of entitlement, my chip, getting that chip off my shoulder, get that chip off your shoulder. Not being so judgmental, all that kind of stuff. So, how's that? Was that good? Did I riff all right?
You riffed great. I'll stop the recording.